Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who may not recognize me, I'm Ed Griffin, and I'm the coordinator of the seminar. How's everyone feeling? Wait till you're done with this program. The subject of money, isn't it a great subject? Everyone's interested in it. No one has any of it. And it's a very mysterious thing. And I think sometimes the mystery is definitely not warranted. I think it's the idea of a mysterious subject is planted in our minds by the monetary scientists who don't want too many people understanding what they're up to. We have developed around us what I would think of as the high priests of finance. And they like to keep their numbers very, very small. But you know, the subject of money really isn't as complicated as you might think. It's like so many other subjects. When you get into it and you just bulldog through the nomenclature and get through all the buzzwords and weed out the mumbo-jumbo, you suddenly wake up in the middle of the night one night and say, oh, is that what they were talking about? And it's just that simple. Sometimes you do have to bulldog it quite a bit, but I hope that we can do a lot of bulldogging here today, and at the end of this session you'll say, that wasn't so difficult after all. But the hard part about comprehending the subject of money is that it is, by definition, an incredible tale. Incredible meaning unbelievable. The subject matter that I'm going to be covering today is literally incredible to most people. It is unbelievable to the average man. And for that reason, knowing that we're going uphill against credibility, a lot of what I'm going to be covering today is perhaps going to be bogged down with quotations and references, and we'll have to prove our way as we go. I'm hoping there are quite a few skeptics in the audience today. I hope we're not just talking among ourselves. And for the skeptics, I'll try and be a little defensive in the documentation and bore you with a lot of quotations. This seminar is based on certain assumptions. There are 4 of them. The first assumption is that the present monetary system is in crisis. And we believe that it's going to collapse very soon and be replaced by a new monetary system. The second assumption is that this collapse will be sudden and cataclysmic. It will, in fact, destroy the middle class, or most of it, leaving behind only the rich and the poor. The third assumption is that most people will not be able to protect themselves against this crisis, mainly because they are ignorant of what is happening to them. They are ignorant because of various reasons, but the fact is they just don't know why the crisis has arrived, and therefore they won't know what to do about it. In fact, they will follow the advice of the same monetary scientists who brought about the crisis in the first place, and they won't have a chance. The fourth assumption is that if we take a little time and a little effort and study history, monetary history, it is possible to come to certain conclusions and enlightenments, and it is possible for the average person, regardless of his economic status, to develop a financial plan, as you will, to protect himself in the event of this collapse. That's what this seminar is all about. As we tried to make clear in our promotional material, this is not a doom and gloom approach, although much of it is going to be very doomy and gloomy. We do think that it is possible for people to do very well in this. And we do not need to feel guilty about profiting or doing better than our fellow man. I don't think we need to. You might be interested to know that out of all of the thousands of invitations that we sent out to this seminar, only about 2% responded. That means 98% aren't interested for whatever reason. Maybe we didn't do a very good job with the brochure, but I think we did. The fact is most people are not interested, or they are afraid of the subject because they feel that it's too complicated for them, or more likely than not, they are simply not interested in making the effort to become informed. So be it. This is their choice, and they will be among the ones who fall, and it will be up to us who perhaps do a little bit better to be charitable to them. But don't feel sorry for them. It's their choice. That's a hard position, but this is one of the first psychological insights that you must prepare yourself with as we go further on this material and we talk about what is going to happen in the future. You have to steel yourself psychologically to certain realities, no matter how unpleasant they may be. One more warning before we get down to it. You may think as we progress through this session that I have wandered from the topic because we'll go into so much history, and you may think, well, what's that got to do with the present monetary crisis? I would just like to assure you that everything I am talking about today has a direct bearing on the present monetary crisis, and when we reach the end of this presentation, I trust that you will see how it all comes together. One more thing I must tell you, and that is that we could talk for perhaps a week on the subject of money. We have to narrow the scope of this presentation. We're not going to delve into fractional reserve banking or so much of the history of gold and coins and so forth, simply because there isn't time to do so. It's an important study, but perhaps not as important as some of the things we'll be covering. The point is that we will be narrowing the focus of this seminar down to one specific category of information, and this is it. We'll be talking about the quiet conquest of the American people by an international cabal which exercises its power through the secret science of creating money. Now I have to define the word cabal. According to the American Heritage Dictionary, the word cabal is defined as a conspiratorial group of plotters and schemers. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the most accurate definition I could possibly find for the group of people about whom we will be talking this morning. Now, there are three kinds of conquest. I said that the American people had been quietly conquered. There are three kinds of conquest. First, there is military, the old-fashioned style of conquest. That is not what we're talking about today. Then there is psychological conquest. This can take many forms. Perhaps the most prevalent form that we can observe in the world today is the advance of international communism, which, as you know, does not conquer its enemies or its victims by military means, although that is a background part of the strategy. The primary conquest is done through the mind, by softening up the target nation, lowering their will to resist, and conquering the minds and the loyalties of the idealistic young people who will then go out and dedicate their lives and even sacrifice their lives, if necessary, for a utopian dream of world communism, socialism, brotherhood, equality, justice, and all this sort of thing, which of course is a sham, but these idealists do not know that. They had been conquered psychologically and turned into automatons on behalf of the communist empire. As important a subject as that is, it is not the topic of our seminar this morning. The third kind of conquest is the one which is given the least amount of attention, and that is economic conquest. Economic conquest allows control of a population without resentment on the part of the population, because the masses are simply not aware of the fact that they have been conquered. Therefore, they don't realize that they have masters. Their rulers and their masters are invisible to them, or at least to all but about 1% of that population. And that is the kind of conquest which we will be talking about today. The purpose of this seminar is to strip away the veil of secrecy and mystery and invisibility to this cabal, so you can see exactly who they are and how they operate. And then we will talk at the conclusion of the seminar about ways to protect yourself against it and ultimately to destroy it. Now, what evidence is there that such a cabal exists? I think that's a good starting point, especially for the skeptic. We don't want to step over that very important issue. Don't take my word for it. There are people who are far more qualified to speak on that subject than I. After all I have done is read about it, research it, and report it to you. But for the skeptic, there is a very interesting and important book called Tragedy and Hope, written by Professor Carroll Quigley. I'm sure many of you in this audience are familiar with this book, but for those of you who are not, it is definitely worth taking a moment to describe. This book, 1,348 pages of dry history, I might say, the history of Western civilization, much of it is centered around this group, this cabal, and its impact on world affairs. Now, who was Quigley and what gives him the authority to talk about this group? Quigley he's deceased now. When he wrote this book, he was professor of history at Georgetown University. He was on the editorial board of the monthly periodical Current History. He was a lecturer and consultant for such organizations as the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, the Brookings Institution, the U.S. Weapons Laboratory, the Naval College, the Smithsonian Institute, and the State Department. He was closely associated with many of the family dynasties that are associated with this cabal. He was definitely on the inside of this group, and he was a friendly apologist. On page 950 of his book, this is what he said, quote, "I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or to most of its aims, and have for much of my life been close to it and to many of its instruments. In general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown." Now, Quigley describes this group not with the word cabal. After all, he's friendly to it. He describes them, interestingly enough, as international bankers. I say interestingly because that is a phrase that many of us have been reading over and over in some of the wild literature that we all get. That the international bankers are coming, and you have to sort of back off and wonder if these people really know what they're talking about, because every third word is underlined and every other word is in bold letters, and it's not a very credible piece of literature, but these people are always talking about the international bankers. I say this because it is a fact that for years I shied away from this subject mainly because of this kind of literature. Well, it's interesting to me that Quigley calls them international bankers. They're not bankers, as we'll see in a moment. They are international, but the word bankers is not the right word for them, because frankly they don't operate banks. They are really financiers. Quigley calls them international bankers. Now, these are not the local commercial bankers that you and I deal with every week or so. This is not the friendly guy that sits across the desk from you and negotiates a loan for your automobile. These are in a whole different category by themselves. Historically, these international bankers or financiers include such names as Baring, Ambrose, Lazard, Erlanger, Warburg, Schroeder, Seligman, the Spires, Mirabeau, Millay, Fold, and above all, Rothschild, Morgan, and more recently in history, Rockefeller. Now, my own research has led me to the conclusion that there are 6 goals or steps in the master plan of this cabal. Now, this is strictly my own opinion. You can boil it down to 3 goals or 9 or 1, if you will, but I see 6 of them as rather clearly defined and recognizable. And here they are. Number 1, loan or give money to governments and their agents to gain political influence. If you loan money to somebody, you are influential with that person, obviously. Second, cash in that influence to obtain an exclusive franchise to produce the nation's money. We'll be talking a lot about that. This is a franchise to produce the nation's money. 3, use this privilege to create money literally out of nothing. 4, amass untold wealth, not by spending that money, but by lending that money to both government and the private sector and collecting interest on it. Very important point to keep in mind in this discussion. People have the idea, I used to have the idea, that when these international financiers or central bankers created money out of nothing, whoopee, they went out and spent it. That's what I would do if I had the power to create money out of nothing. No, that's not how it works. We'll be talking about it in more detail later. They do not spend that money. They lend that money, and they collect interest on it. And that is good enough. 5, use this wealth and political influence to consolidate control over government, institutions, and the media to direct all aspects of national life. And 6, coordinate this control with other branches of the cabal in other countries to further international objectives toward the eventual creation of a de facto world government, totalitarian in nature, with themselves in control behind the scenes. Now that perhaps is the most controversial of the points that I would like to demonstrate today, but I think that anyone who studies the history of this group must come inevitably to that conclusion. Getting back to Professor Quigley, on page 324, this is how he describes what I just said. He summarized the final goal of this cabal, or what he calls international bankers, as follows, quote, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion. Please note the word feudalist. Incredible perception here, and people read right over that word, miss it. You'll see later how important that is. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchange, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. You may wonder how these people have such tremendous political influence. Don't forget, they can reward any politician tremendously in the business world. How many politicians do you know are elected to office with nothing but a pair of shoes with a hole in the left sole, and they come out not too long later and they have millions of dollars of assets, and they sure didn't make that in the salary as a congressman or a senator. But we need a common understanding of terms. When we get now into the subject of how they actually perform these steps, there are certain words and terms and procedures which we need to define and understand very carefully. And so what I'm going to do now is take you on a very fast trip, a walkthrough on definitions and concepts, or what I call a crash course on the secret science of money. And I will try to condense this universe of information to about a 20 or 25-minute segment. So hang on. We're going to be moving pretty rapidly, and the substance of this course is divided into 4 subjects. The first one is what I call the counterfeit mechanism. The second is the Dillinger mechanism. The third is the duck dinner mechanism. And the fourth is the mandrake mechanism. Now, what are those all about? Let's start with the counterfeit mechanism. Before we can talk about money, we have to agree on what money is. You'd be surprised at how many experts, professors, and professionally recognized economists cannot agree on a definition of money. In fact, dictionaries don't agree. No one agrees. I don't expect you to agree with me. So what I'm going to do is give you my definition and tell you that's what it is. At least for the purposes of this seminar, so that when I use the word, you'll know what I mean by it. When I use the word money, I define it as follows. Money is whatever is the accepted medium of exchange within a given society. But there are three possible kinds of money. There are commodity money, promissory money, and fiat money. It's essential that we understand the difference between those three different possible kinds of money. First, commodity money is pretty easy to grasp. It is a commodity. It is a thing of intrinsic value which people want because of itself, and they use it for money also. Why do they use it for money also? Well, because you have to have something for money to facilitate the economy, and certain tangible commodities are better suited for money uses than others. Eggs are not very well suited because they get rotten. Cows are not suited, although cows historically have been used as money. In fact, if you look up the derivation of words like pecuniary, the Latin derivation of the word, pecuniary, relates to cows, because there was a time when cattle was negotiated and became a form of money. But cows get sick and they die, so it's not a very good storehouse of value. The point is that throughout history, almost every society that has had any substantial development of the economy at all has settled upon one commodity and only one commodity as useful money, and that is gold. The reason is because gold has many unique qualities that makes it very convenient as barter. I'm not going to bore you with all of that. You probably know that. I mean, it doesn't perish. It's non-perishable. It's easily divisible. You can always determine its value by weighing it and so forth. It has a lot of unique qualities that make it ideal for barter. So it is a commodity which has intrinsic value of its own, but also has a very good utility for barter, and therefore it has become the universal money throughout all history. But bear in mind that gold is not mystical. Sometimes people call it magic. They'd like to have you believe that the only reason gold is of value is because of psychological reactions on the part of the public. This is not so. There's nothing mystical or magical about it. It's simply that it's a very useful commodity for barter. It has been so for the last 3,000 years, and I think for the next 3,000 years it will continue. All right, back to the three kinds of money. We've talked about, very briefly, about commodity money. Now, what is promissory money? Now, promissory money is a promise. It is a promise to give somebody real money, or in other words, to give someone commodity money. Now, gold is heavy. You don't like to carry it around too much. If you need to make a payment for a lot of it, you don't want to have a wheelbarrow full of gold. You give promises to pay in commodity money, and these usually wind up on pieces of paper. You write out your promise. It's a contract. I owe you. I am going to pay you so much gold, or whatever, but usually gold. And you take this piece of paper and you say, well, that looks like a valid contract. I know this fellow, and I trust him. He's always kept his promises before. This could be in the form of a warehouse receipt where I'm instructing the warehouseman to give you my gold if he should present that piece of paper and he recognizes my signature. That's sort of how it started historically. Or it could be a bank which has got gold in its vault and it prints up a piece of paper and puts fancy scrolls around it and puts the bank president's picture on it and signatures and stamps and seals and numbers and all these things. It's still a piece of paper with a promise to pay in gold. It's a banknote. People look at it and say, oh, I recognize that bank. It's a good bank. I'll accept this. It's a promise to pay, though, in commodity money, and that's all it is. So Promissory money is nothing but an extension of commodity money. Important to realize that if there is no commodity money, then there can be no promissory money. In practical terms, we may think of them merely as different forms of the same thing. But promissory money is mainly of historical interest because, with the very few exceptions, promissory money simply no longer exists in the real world today. And that leads us to the third kind of money, which is fiat money. That is the money of today, everywhere in the world. Fiat money is also paper money, but it doesn't carry a promise to be redeemed in anything. It not only has no intrinsic value of its own, it doesn't represent anything of intrinsic value either. It doesn't spring out of the value of a useful commodity. It is derived solely from government edict. The government says, this is the money and you will use it. If you don't like that idea, off to jail you go. That's the basic form of totalitarian government, and fiat money cannot exist without totalitarian government. It is, in fact, legalized counterfeit, which is why I call the creation of fiat money the counterfeit mechanism. Now, why would anybody accept fiat money? Well, there are three reasons. The main reason is that they're ignorant. You know, with the passage of time in the United States today, there are very few people who remember real commodity money or promissory money. Isn't that true? I mean, the younger generation, everybody under 35, I have to figure this out, but anyway, most people under 40 cannot really remember real money. They become used to fiat money, and they've never even questioned whether this is any different than what their grandparents used to have. It never even dawned on them to ask that question. It never dawns on most people to inquire as to what other kinds of money there might be, or what is the nature of these pieces of paper I'm using for money. So ignorance is the main reason that people accept it. The second reason is that they have faith. Even those who know that this is fiat money and worthless will accept it because they have faith that others will accept it too. In other words, this guy down the street is so stupid, he'll accept it too, so I guess I'll accept it. I can always dump it on him and get something of value. As long as the population is confident or has faith that everybody in the society will also accept this fiat money, then it works. But what happens when people start losing faith? Now you have a problem. The third reason then that people accept it is fear. Because when they stop accepting it out of their free will, the government steps in and orders them to accept it. These are legal tender laws. You must accept this money in the payment of all debts, public and private, or off with your head, or something less severe. So people accept it out of fear of punishment by their government. It's interesting to note, though, historically, that whenever a monetary system starts to collapse and is in the final stages of collapse, even fear of punishment does not do the job. People will stop accepting that money, and they would rather go to jail than risk losing everything they own of value. This is a historical fact. We come to the conclusion from this history that fiat money always collapses. There are no exceptions anywhere in history where fiat money has been created that it did not eventually collapse. Now, there's a reason for that. The reason is that when politicians have the power to create money out of nothing, politicians and monetary scientists, when men have the power to create money out of nothing, that is a heady wine. And eventually those men will be subverted by this temptation and this power, and they will just carry it to extremes that just blow your mind. It always has happened. It always will happen, I believe, as long as Homo sapiens continues to carry the psychological genes that he has. It may not happen right away. You may have a bunch of good men in government, and they will restrain themselves, but they eventually are retired and replaced by others. It is only a question of time before this power corrupts the men who hold it. And the government and the bankers will create money as though it were falling from the heavens. And that is why money, fiat money, self-destructs. The mechanism is called inflation because so much money is being created that it begins to exceed the value of all goods and services in the society, and this gap gets wider and wider. Yes, you're producing more goods, more services are available, and the cost of producing these things is going down because of improved technology. All of that is on the good side, but on the other side, the monetary scientists and the political scientists are creating money more than enough to offset that gain. And the gap gets wider and wider and wider and wider until finally the cost in terms of those dollars they're creating becomes exorbitant. That's inflation, and that is the destruction of the monetary system. And I call that the Dillinger mechanism. Now, why do I call it the Dillinger mechanism? The reason is that this is more than just inflation. We think of inflation as the erosion of our dollars, purchasing power, rising prices, and all that sort of thing. But ladies and gentlemen, when you really analyze this mechanism, it is far more than that. It is the transfer of wealth. What happens as the result of inflation is the transfer of wealth from most of the people in the middle class to a few people in the upper class. I hate to use the word upper class, but to a few people at the very top of the economic spectrum. It is not only the transfer of wealth, it is the theft of wealth. And I think calling it the Dillinger mechanism after the well-known prohibition gangster John Dillinger is appropriate. I'd like to digress on the subject of inflation just for a second because it will give us an insight into what I believe is directly ahead here in America. Classical economists such as Ludwig von Mises has explained that inflation always takes a course that can be identified through three phases. Now, there's no demarcation between one phase and the other. It's just you know when you're there. You may not know when you got there, I mean, at what point you stepped over the line, but when you're firmly in the middle of it, you know that you're there. The first stage is what might be called moderate inflation, phase one. Now, in this phase, the government is expanding the supply of money greater than the expansion of goods and services, but there's little or no public expectation of the impact that this is going to have on prices. We've seen this happen over and over and over again. As a matter of fact, it's happening right now. Right now. The government is expanding the money supply at a very substantial rate, but people are not raising their prices for their labor or their goods because they don't expect anything to happen as a result of it. We've had a period of moderate inflation, a period of stability, and so nothing's happening. We'll just keep going as we are. So, there is true inflation in terms of the expansion of the money supply, but there is no inflation in terms of rising prices. The reason the rising prices are lagging is because of public expectation, psychological factors only. And that is phase one. Now, phase two happens when the public begins to wake up to the fact that, hey, money is easier, I can get more money from my goods, I can borrow more, I can expand, things are costing me more now a little bit, I better raise my prices, and whoops, maybe I better begin to figure in a little inflation in all my calculations for the future. They begin to say, well, I want to earn 6% on my money. But inflation is running at 6%, so if I want to make 6%, I guess I better insist on 12%. This is phase two. When the public begins to realize the game and begins to calculate on it continuing, now prices start catching up with inflation, and as a matter of fact, they exceed inflation. They pass inflation by. It's sort of a pendulum action or a catch-up reaction, springboard action. Now, this is very, very unnerving to the government because all of a sudden they're not having the advantage of creating money out of nothing because prices are going up faster than they're creating money, so they start to accelerate their creation of money to get ahead of the public expectation. This always happens. When that happens, now you're getting toward the end of phase 2, and by the time you get into phase 3, which generally is called hyperinflation, phase 1, by the way, might be called moderate inflation, phase 2 might be called double-digit inflation, and phase 3, hyperinflation. In phase 3, the prosperity effect has been nullified by the expectation effect. See, people have been enjoying this prosperity of inflation, but now the expectation effect is becoming so large that people begin to say, wait a minute, this money is getting more and more worthless. I better get out of money and into tangibles. Now they rush out and they buy a new car. They'll buy hardware, television sets. They'll buy silverware. They'll buy gold coins. They'll buy extra real estate. They'll just get rid of whatever money they have because they know that their money is going down so rapidly. They're going to get into tangible assets. There's a flood of this sort of thing happening. There's a rush away from money, and when that happens, the value of money really plummets then because of psychological factors. In addition to the inflation on the part of the government, you've got the mechanism on the part of the government on one hand, the psychological factors on the part of the population on the other, and these two combined absolutely make money worthless in a society. Where this has happened historically, we won't take time to talk about it. You're probably familiar with the classical experience in Germany. The value of the mark, the value of whatever the unit might be in that country, plummets to absolute zero. And those who are holding on to those marks or those pesos or those dollars or whatever they're called, they're wiped out. Anyone who has money at the end of this phase is destroyed, at least to the extent of the money that he holds. Now, toward the end of this cycle, the government always responds to hyperinflation by creating a new money supply. Now, this is a pretty good trick for most of the population. It works once or twice. The officials say to the people, well, yes, we have a real economic problem here. The money is becoming worthless, so we're going to get rid of that old money, that bad money, and we're going to replace it with new, good money. And the average, person says, oh, golly, my government is really taking charge. They're going to solve this problem. They don't realize that these are the jerks that caused the problem in the first place. They really think that these people are going to solve the problem. So they believe it. Many people believe it. Most people believe it. The ones who don't want to think negative thoughts. The ones who like to think about a rosy future. They believe it. So they issue the new money supply. It's usually a different shape, different color or something. And they usually multiply the factors so that you turn in 10 of your old units and you get 1 unit back. Or maybe you turn in 100 of your old units and you get 1 unit back. Well, that works pretty good because people say, gee, I've got all this worthless money. I turn in and now I get 1 unit will buy as much as 10 of those old units. And they think that somehow that made them richer. It's amazing. This has always happened. So this happens, the new money comes out, and then finally the same process continues and the public realizes, well, wait a minute, nothing's changed. The new money hasn't changed anything, and they start getting rid of that. And in some cases, the government will try the new money switch again, a second time, but usually the second time it has less impact on the population, but it prolongs the final day of reckoning. Now, as I said a moment ago, the result of inflation is the destruction of the middle class. The acquisition of all the wealth that was held by the middle class is now in the hands of the financial leaders of the world or the nation, and in the hands of their financial institutions which they control. It may not be in their name, but they control the financial institutions that in turn acquire the property. And people wind up now renting, in essence, renting the property they once were trying to own, and they are, in fact, serfs to the landholders. Now, one of the best overviews of the effects of inflation was given to us by, you'll never believe it, John Maynard Keynes. Now, he's a man who should know, because it was Keynes who advanced many of the economic doctrines that make inflation inevitable. And it was he, for example, who advocated government debt as the path to national prosperity. And it was he who labeled gold as old-fashioned and a barbaric relic. But nevertheless, this is what Keynes said in his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Quote, "By a continuous process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose." End quote. And that is the truth. Fiat money makes the destruction of the monetary system inevitable. I want to repeat that point, because we have fiat money today, and the money we have today will self-destruct. There is no question about that, at least in my mind, and anyone who has seen the historical overview of this cannot deny the fact. There's nothing different. In fact, things are worse today. There's less understanding of money today than there ever was on the part of the people. There's less restraint on the part of the political scientists and the monetary scientists today than there ever was in history. And all of the forces that are at work today that have always been at work in the past, and I am saying to you that if you don't believe that our money is going to self-destruct, well, good luck. Now let's talk about the duck dinner mechanism. I remember hearing the story of a farmer who had a pond out behind his barn. And, of course, in the summertime, there was always a good flock of ducks there, and he would go out with his shotgun in the morning and get a few of them, and all summer long he would have duck dinner. But he was unhappy because in the fall, these ducks would take off for warmer climes and no duck dinner during the winter. And then he got the idea that if he started putting out grain for the ducks and making it easy for them to find food during the summer, and especially in the fall, maybe they would hang around. And sure enough, they did. You know, free lunch. See how it worked? You all came, didn't you? So anyway, the ducks hung around. And some of them didn't go south in the fall. And this happened a couple of years in a row, and by that time the flock got larger and larger every winter until finally they were all hanging around. And wouldn't you know, the farmer had duck dinner all winter. Well, something very similar to that is happening, and always has happened, in the economic marketplace. You make things very easy for people, unnaturally easy economically, make credit unnaturally easy. If you make gaining wealth unnaturally easy, you're going to lure people into an unnaturally precarious position, to the point where they may not be able to fly when they have to. And so I call this the duck dinner mechanism, the lure of easy credit, the lure of low interest rates, the availability of large sums of money, and the example of looking at your neighbors and your friends, and they're all making it in the stock market or speculative investments, or they're buying real estate, and you know their value of their estate is going up, and the guy next door buys himself a big RV. On the other side, he has a big boat that's sitting in his driveway, and your wife looks at you and she says, "Honey, are we doing this right? You know, you're still saving your money and not getting in over your head." People are leveraging their credit, and they're making money on what they owe. And so this lures all the ducks out. Hang around to get into an unnatural position where they have so much debt that they can't fly. And then, of course, when the contraction of the economy happens, they lose everything, or almost everything. The saw moves in two directions, if I may use that analogy. You know, a saw has teeth pointing in one direction. When you pull it toward you, it doesn't cut. It's just getting ready for the cutting stroke. And then when you push it, it takes all the wood with it. Now, the saw will not cut if it just sits in one place. You need to pull it and push it, pull it and push it. And this is what we see happening in the economy over and over again. Expansion of the money supply, easy credit. Contraction of the money supply, tight credit. Expansion of the money supply, easy credit. Contraction of the money supply, tight credit. And what happens? In each cycle, each stroke of the saw, a lot of people get cut out. And it just depends on how far they cock the saw and how many times they strike it. Each time the saw moves, it takes with it some people in the middle class. Now let's talk about the Mandrake mechanism. This is the question of how does money actually come into being. Perhaps the most mysterious, quote unquote, of all of these subjects, because it is shrouded with all kinds of words which do not mean what you think they mean. Words which have special meanings which are unknown to the average person. Words which are thrown out there deliberately, in my opinion, deliberately to confuse and to deceive. I call this the Mandrake mechanism after the comic strip magician during the 1940s. Mandrake the magician had a specialty of creating things out of nothing. He was very good at that. He also was pretty good at making things disappear back into nothing. Now we're talking about the central banks and the creation and the destruction of money. Now we're not talking about commodity money here or promissory money. Those things are money of the past. We're talking about today's money, fiat money. The first thing to understand about the Mandrake mechanism is that the government does not simply print it. There's a lot of confusion on this point. People have the image that when the government creates money, all they do is just pick up the phone and call the Treasury Department or the Bureau of Engraving and say, turn on the press, fellas, we need some more $1,000 bills. That is not how it happens. It could happen that way, and there are periods in history where governments have tried that, but generally it's a very unpopular move because it's awfully obvious. It's direct. You know, people can understand that. You can realize that the presses are turning out money, and you see a lot of money in circulation, and you see inflation, and look who's to blame. It's the guy with the button on the printing press, and that's the government. That's easy. So they don't do that so much anymore. Far more sophisticated approach. The cabal that is responsible for the creation of money out of nothing is actually a partnership. It's important to recognize that we're not just talking about the government, or we're not just talking about the international financiers. We're talking about these two groups together. They really cannot function as well separately as they do in a partnership. You've heard me use the phrase before, and I'll use it again and again. This is a joining together of the political scientists and the monetary scientists. You may substitute the short term, the politicians and the bankers, but I don't think those words are nearly descriptive enough. These are not just politicians, these are not just bankers. These are true scientists, and what they are practicing, their science that they are practicing is very obscure. It is a secret science, and it is not just flying by the seat of their pants. So the cabal is a partnership. And when they come together, here's what they decide to do. First, they create what is known as a central bank. Now, here's the first of those words that don't mean what they say. A central bank is not a bank. Okay? What is a central bank? It is an organization which has been authorized by the government to create the nation's money on behalf of the government and to lend that money to both government and the private sector and collect interest on it. And that organization is also given the power of government to regulate all of the real banks in the nation. So, in essence, the central bank becomes like the government. The government gives its power to this organization and says, now, we delegate it to you. You go ahead and do whatever you want to do. It is given a franchise. That's the word I used in the beginning. A franchise to create the money and act as though it were government. But it is not a bank. It regulates the banks. It controls the banks. It can close the banks up if it wishes to, and the banks are totally dependent upon it. But it is insulated from government. Depending on the particular country in which you are examining this relationship, you will find that in some countries, in fact in most countries, in all countries except the United States, the central bank is supposedly an official agency of the government. In the United States, it is a separate private corporation which has the franchise from the government. But it makes no difference, really, because in all cases, these organizations are insulated from the political power of the people. They are autonomous to a very high degree. I won't say 100%, but would you believe 95%? Which is good enough. So, all right. The first step in the Mandrake mechanism is to create a central bank. The next step is to create a budget deficit. Now, that's not hard to do. All governments, with very few exceptions, have this tendency to create budget deficits. The political scientists take care of that pretty well, leaving the rest to the monetary scientists. So now, the government has to borrow money to take care of that deficit, doesn't it? Now, there are two kinds of borrowing that we must distinguish here. Again, deceptive vocabulary. There is honest borrowing, which accounts for very little of what goes on in the world today. And there is dishonest borrowing, which is not borrowing at all. I'll come to that in a second. The honest borrowing is when, let's say, for example, the United States government has a deficit and it wants to borrow money to cover that deficit. If it offers its treasury bills or bonds for sale, and you or some corporation or institution buys those bonds, that is honest borrowing. Now, you may say that it's unwise for the government to go into debt and to spend beyond its income. That's another issue. But if it has to do so, then at least it's borrowing money that really existed. It came out of your pocket. You had earned it. Or it comes out of the treasury of some corporation or a savings institution. The money already existed before the transaction. So no money is created in real honest borrowing. Unfortunately, that is not the major part of what's happening with government borrowing in the world today. We come to dishonest borrowing, which is not borrowing at all. When the government obtains its money not from individuals or organizations or institutions which already have money, but obtains this from the central bank. Now, the central bank gives the money to the government in this fashion. The government writes out a piece of paper that says bond or treasury bill or whatever. And again, they put curlicues around the edge of it and put somebody's signature on it, stamps and numbers and seals. It's a piece of paper, it says IOU. And they give that to the central bank. Central bank takes it and puts it in its vault. And it whips out its checkbook and writes another piece of paper with not so many curlicues and stamps and numbers on it, has a few numbers and so forth, and it gives the check to the government. Now, that check came from nowhere. I mean, it was just a piece of paper. The central bank had no assets to back it up, had no money in the vault. had no gold coins, had no investors putting their money into a savings account, had nothing, absolutely nothing. I want to stress that point. It just had a checkbook and a little bit of ink, and it wrote out this check for $9 million or $1 billion and gave it to the government. And the government takes it and deposits it into its checking account with Chase Manhattan or whatever, and now it can write checks against its balance and pay its employees and buy armaments and pay welfare and do whatever it has to do. Now, if you and I were to whip out a checkbook with nothing behind it and write a check and give it to somebody, we'd go to jail. But the central bank is authorized by law to do that. That is the Mandrake mechanism. The central bank creates money literally out of nothing and is authorized to do so by law. So the money then goes into the coffers of the federal government. The federal government starts to spend that money, and this newly created money, which is not printed on a press at all, it is merely checkbook money, which accounts for, 95% of all money in circulation is checkbook money, which means that most of the time it's nothing but magnetic impulses on a computer tape. That's all it is. That money starts to ripple through the country. Those who are closest to the government trough, of course, do the best. The ones with all the government contracts and the people on the payroll, they do very well. But then it comes through their checkbooks into somebody else's checkbooks, and finally, by the time it gets out to you and to me, we've got very little benefit from all this. Because by the time it gets to us, the prices of everything we want to buy with that money has gone up because of this process. So it's useless to us. That is the Mandrake mechanism. Now they call this monetizing the debt. Isn't that a nice phrase? Whenever you read in the magazines that the government is monetizing the debt, or the Federal Reserve System is monetizing the debt, just mentally replace the word Mandrake mechanism. Now, I don't want to bore you with this, but you just have to know this. The loans then start to go into the banking system. Remember, it's not just the central bank here. They're the ones that set all this up. They're the ones that create this money by buying these bonds. But then this money goes into the other banking circles, and it's not just the money that was created by the central bank, but by the time now it gets into the commercial banks, which are regulated by the central bank, the commercial banks also have a chance to create money out of nothing. Because when the commercial banks get hold of this newly created money by whatever circuitous path it gets hold of it, it now calls this an asset on its books, and it can lend money 9 times, 10 times more than its assets. So this money that was created out of nothing for the federal government, by the time it gets into the commercial banks, is multiplied by 9 or 10. Tremendous leverage. And here's how it works. You might mentally picture an inverted pyramid like this. Now, granted, it's not a nice smooth pyramid. It will be made up of blocks, some of which are wider than others. But if you sort of stand back and squint your eyes, you'll recognize that it's a pyramid shape with the biggest blocks on top and the little tiny one with a tip on it at the bottom. At the bottom of this inverted pyramid are the government securities, the IOUs, Treasury certificates, the bills, the bonds, and so forth. These are issued to cover the deficit of the budget. These now at the next level are converted into currency. Some of it is converted into actual money that you can put in your pocket, but most of it converted into government checks. The next level in the pyramid is that the same IOUs now that the central bank is holding are also transferred into assets of the central bank. Now, miraculously, these little pieces of paper, these IOUs, now are carried as assets by the central bank. They are assets because they are assured that the government will pay them off, even if it has to wring every last bit of blood out of your hide to do so, because they have the power of taxation. So it is logically carried as an asset. The next level in the pyramid, these assets now are converted into loans to the commercial banks. The the commercial banks get their money from the central bank. They don't just get it for nothing, they borrow it. They borrow it from the central bank. So these same IOUs were the basis for lending to the government. Now the same IOUs, because they're now called assets, are the basis for lending to the commercial banks. Sort of double dipping, you might say. Now, the loans at the commercial bank level are classified as reserves. Isn't it wonderful what these words can do? Now, they're on their books as reserves. The next level, these reserves are converted back into loans, but this time to the business and the private sector. And they are leveraged, as I said a moment ago, by about 9-to-1 over reserves. And finally, at the top of this tottering pyramid, as the loans finally become the bulk of the nation's checkbook and the electronic money supply. So, abacadabra, zis boom ba, Mandrake couldn't have done it better. And it all starts with these little IOUs coming from the federal government. Now, think about that for a second. There are some very ponderous conclusions. One of the most incredible realizations is the fact that today every dollar that exists, either in the form of currency or checkbook money, and that includes the credit card money, the plastic money that is merely an extension of the checkbook money, all of it, in other words, our entire money supply exists only because it first was borrowed by someone. Now, it may not be you, you may be out of debt, but if you have money in your pocket, that is because it was borrowed by someone. Now, they owe the banks for this money, or you wouldn't have it. It would not be in circulation. And that means that every dollar in the whole money supply is earning daily compounded interest payable to the banking and the financial circle. Do you think you aren't working for somebody and you don't know it? The whole money supply is earning compounded interest for the financial masters of this country at one level or another. The money doesn't exist, I want to repeat this, until someone borrows it. A portion of every business venture, every investment, every profit, every transaction which involves money, and that even includes losses, even if the transaction involves a loss to someone, any transaction, a portion of that is earmarked as payment to a bank somewhere along the line. And what did the bank do to earn this interest, this payment? Did it lend this money out of its own capital? Did it take in all the savings of widows and hardworking people and lend it out at interest so that these people could have an honest return on their investments? No, it did none of these things. It simply made a bookkeeping entry and it created the money out of nothing. Now, that's a pretty good scheme if you can get away with it. And they are getting away with it, and no one is really trying to blow the whistle because they don't understand the Mandrake mechanism. And as I said earlier, it is incredible. If you try to explain it to someone, they'll say, "Oh, I don't believe that. It couldn't be. Our government wouldn't allow that to happen. That's ridiculous." It was Thomas Edison. He was among the 1 or 2% who were able to see through this legalized scam. Now, he was kind of off in other sectors of his economic analysis, but on this one he was right on. He said, quote, "People who will not turn a shovel full of dirt on the project or contribute a pound of materials will collect more money than will the people who supply all the materials and do all the work." End quote. That's it. That is feudalism. It's not an exaggeration to say that the entire nation is working to support an invisible master, and doing so without resentment or complaint because, for the most part, the people are totally unaware of that fact. They have been economically conquered in a quiet war of which they have been totally unaware. Mariner Eccles was the governor of the Federal Reserve System in 1941. And on June 24 of that year, Eccles was asked to give testimony before the House Committee on Banking and Currency. Now, he didn't like to do that. And reading through that testimony is interesting because you think politicians can sidestep answers and be like a greased eel. You should read the testimony of governors of the Federal Reserve Board. They're masters. But in this one segment, he was pretty straightforward. The purpose of the hearing was to obtain information regarding the role of the Federal Reserve in creating the conditions that led to the Depression of the 1930s. And we're going to talk about that later. Congressman Wright Patman, who was chairman of that committee, asked the question, how did you get the money to buy those $2 billion worth of government securities in 1933? Eccles answered, we created it. Patman, out of what? Answer, out of the right to issue credit money. Question, and there is nothing behind it, is there, except our government's credit? Answer, that's what our money system is. If there were no debts in our money system, there wouldn't be any money. End quote. Robert Hemphill was the former credit manager of the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta. Now, he's speaking from a position of first-hand knowledge. In the foreword to a book by Irving Fisher entitled 100% Money, Hemphill said this, quote, if all the bank loans were paid, no one could have a bank deposit, and there would not be a dollar of coin or currency in circulation. This is a staggering thought. Someone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation. When one gets a complete grasp of the picture, the tragic absurdity of our hopeless situation is almost incredible. But there it is. End quote. And so, literally, ladies and gentlemen, this is not a hyperbole, this is not an exaggeration to make a point. Literally, the entire money system of the United States and of the world today is built upon debt. And who benefits from this debt? Well, he who collects the interest, of course. Now, that word interest, does that mean what it says? It's another one of the deceptive vocabulary. It is not interest, ladies and gentlemen. It would be interest if you were paying on real money that was borrowed, but this is not real money that was borrowed. This was created out of nothing. What this really is a royalty to the political and monetary scientists who created the money. You're paying them a royalty for their service. Or if you wish to be even more hard-nosed about it, I would suggest that we are paying them a tribute. We are paying a tribute to our economic conquerors. But whatever you want to call it, we're paying it every hour of every day we live. And when you finally come to this understanding of this reality, you then will understand the Mandrake mechanism and why it is so important to the success of the cabal. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now 10:30. Let's take a 15-minute break, and please be here promptly at 10:45.